The rope is already tight. The crowd silent in a way that feels heavier than shouting. A woman stands on uneven ground, her hands bound, her breath shallow but steady. Around her, men and women clutch coats against the cold, some whispering prayers, others staring as if afraid to blink. This is Salem, at the peak of its fear, when accusation has become proof, and suspicion has hardened into certainty. The sentence has already been spoken. Death is no longer a possibility, but an expectation. And in this moment, as another life is about to be taken in the name of righteousness, a question hangs unspoken in the air, heavier than the gallows itself. How did a small community come to accept this as justice? By the end of the trials, more than 200 people would be accused of witchcraft. 19 would be executed by hanging. One man would be pressed to death under stones for refusing to enter a plea. Children as young as 4 would be named as witches. Entire families would be torn apart. Property would be seized. Reputations would be erased. And all of this would happen in a single year, driven not by war or famine alone, but by fear turned inward. Salem was not a city of shadows and superstition alone. It was a working community, divided between Salem village and the wealthier Salem town, separated by distance, money, and power. Most families lived hard lives shaped by poor harvests, harsh winters, and the constant threat of attack from the frontier. Disease was common. Infant mortality was expected. Survival required obedience, discipline, and faith. In such a world, misfortune was never random. It was a message, a warning, or a punishment. Religion did not simply guide daily life. It defined it. The Puritan worldview left little room for doubt. God was present in every success and every failure. The devil, equally real, was believed to be actively working to corrupt the faithful. To live in New England at this time was to believe that unseen forces shaped visible reality. When something went wrong, there was always a reason, and often someone to blame. The crisis began quietly, inside a household. A group of young girls began to suffer fits, convulsions, and strange behavior. They screamed, contorted their bodies, and claimed to see invisible figures tormenting them. A local doctor, unable to find a physical cause, suggested the unthinkable explanation: witchcraft. The idea spread quickly, not because it was absurd, but because it fit perfectly into what people already believed. Accusations followed patterns shaped by long-standing tensions. Women who spoke their minds, owned property, begged for survival, or lived on the edges of society were named first. Enslaved people, already viewed as outsiders, were easy targets. Old grudges resurfaced. Land disputes found new language. Personal resentment gained holy justification. To accuse was to protect oneself, because silence could look like guilt. Once accusations began, they fed on themselves. Confessions were rewarded with mercy, while denial was treated as proof of deeper corruption. Spectral evidence, claims that a spirit appeared in someone's shape, was accepted in court. There was no way to defend against it. If an accuser said they saw you, the damage was already done. And yet, within this terror, people tried to survive in small, human ways. Some confessed to crimes they did not commit, hoping to live. Some prayed loudly and constantly, believing faith might save them. Others stayed silent, clinging to dignity even as it cost them their lives. Families sold possessions to pay legal fees. Children watched parents taken away. Husbands testified against wives. The fabric of trust unraveled thread by thread. At the center of it all was fear of disorder. The colony was young, fragile, and convinced that any moral failure could bring divine punishment upon them all. Leaders believed that rooting out witches was not cruelty, but necessity. To stop was to invite God's wrath. To question the trials was to risk becoming part of them. Standing beneath the gallows, the crowd was not made of monsters. It was made of neighbors, friends, relatives, people who believed they were doing what was required to survive in a dangerous world. And that is what makes this moment so unsettling. Because the horror did not come from madness alone, but from logic built on fear and belief. As the rope tightens and the crowd looks on, one must wonder what invisible line had already been crossed long before this moment arrived, and whether anyone there could still see it clearly anymore. The story does not truly begin at the gallows. It begins decades earlier, in cramped wooden houses, frozen fields, and sermons that lasted for hours. To understand how Salem reached that moment, it is necessary to step back into the daily lives of the people who lived there, long before accusations were spoken aloud. These were not people waiting for hysteria. They were people struggling to endure. The Puritans who settled Massachusetts believed they had entered into a sacred contract with God. They had crossed the ocean not for adventure, but for purity. Their society was meant to be an example, a city upon a hill, watched closely by God and by the world. Every action carried weight. Every mistake carried meaning. Failure was never private. It threatened the entire community. Life in New England was relentless. Winters were long and unforgiving. Crops failed often. Livestock died suddenly. Epidemics moved through towns with terrifying speed. Women gave birth repeatedly, knowing many of their children would not survive infancy. Men worked land that resisted them at every turn. Hunger was familiar. Death was constant. And in a world with limited medical knowledge, faith became both comfort and explanation. Children were raised to see themselves as born sinful, dependent on God's grace for salvation. Fear was not discouraged, it was cultivated. Sermons described hell in vivid detail. The devil was not a metaphor. He was believed to walk among them, searching for the weak, the angry, the isolated. Ministers warned that Satan targeted communities like theirs precisely because of their devotion. Salem village itself was deeply divided. It was poorer and more agricultural than Salem town, which prospered through trade and shipping. The village depended on the town economically, but resented its influence. Arguments over church leadership, taxes, and land boundaries simmered for years. Families aligned themselves into rival factions, passing grievances from one generation to the next. At the center of these tensions was the local church. Ministers were powerful figures, not only spiritually but politically. Disputes over who should lead the congregation were fierce. When Reverend Samuel Parris became minister, conflict intensified. Some supported him fiercely. Others believed he was divisive, harsh, and overly focused on his own authority. These disagreements were not minor. They shaped who trusted whom and who felt watched. Inside Parris's household, the first strange behaviors appeared. His daughter and niece began to scream, crawl under furniture, and claim they were being bitten or pinched by unseen forces. The household was already tense. Parris feared enemies within his congregation. The girls' suffering quickly became public, and public attention magnified it. A doctor examined them and found no physical illness. His conclusion carried enormous weight. He suggested witchcraft. In a society already primed to expect Satan's influence, this explanation did not sound extreme. It sounded responsible. The girls were questioned repeatedly. Adults pressed them for answers. Who was hurting them? Who did this? Under that pressure, names emerged. The first accused fit expectations. An enslaved woman from the Caribbean, a poor beggar, a woman known for arguing with neighbors. Each accusation reinforced the belief that witches hid among society's margins. Once accusations were spoken aloud, they reshaped reality. Ordinary misfortunes were reinterpreted as attacks. A sick child, a spoiled batch of butter, a sudden death. Patterns appeared where none had been noticed before. Fear sharpened memory. People recalled old disputes, harsh words, strange looks. The past was rewritten as evidence. Confession became a twisted form of survival. Those who confessed to witchcraft and named others were spared execution, at least temporarily. Those who maintained their innocence faced death. The message spread quickly. Survival required cooperation with the narrative. Truth became secondary to alignment. Women were particularly vulnerable. Puritan society demanded obedience, silence, and submission from them. Any deviation could be seen as rebellion not just against men, but against God. Women who inherited property, spoke forcefully, or lived independently were viewed with suspicion. Their existence challenged the expected order. Children, too, played a central role. Their accusations were treated as pure and trustworthy. Questioning them meant questioning innocence itself. The idea that children could lie or be mistaken was rarely entertained. Instead, their words were seen as evidence of Satan's cruelty, using the young to expose evil. The courts reinforced the panic. Judges accepted spectral evidence, meaning that if an accuser claimed to see the spirit of the accused harming them, it was allowed as testimony. This created an impossible situation. No one could prove where their spirit had or had not been. Defense became meaningless. As jails filled, fear spread outward. People accused others before they could be accused themselves. Silence felt dangerous. Distance offered no safety. Even respected members of the church were not immune. Once authority figures were named, the idea that anyone could be innocent began to collapse. And still, through all of this, most people believed they were doing the right thing. They believed they were protecting their families, their faith, their future. The tragedy of Salem is not that it was irrational, but that it followed a terrifying internal logic shaped by belief, pressure, and survival. Looking back from the distance of centuries, it is easy to see the cracks forming. The social tensions, the religious extremism, the quiet encouragement of fear. But within the moment, those living through it could only see one step ahead, reacting to threats they believed were real. And as accusations multiplied, the question was no longer who was guilty, but who would be named next. In a society where fear defined morality and survival depended on conformity, was there ever a real chance for reason to interrupt the path Salem had begun to follow? As the accusations multiplied, the shape of Salem's fear began to change. What had started inside a single household now spread through kitchens, barns, and meeting houses. Neighbors no longer spoke freely. Ordinary gestures took on dangerous meanings. A glance held too long, a muttered prayer, a refusal to attend church. All could be remembered later as signs of guilt. Trust, once fragile, began to collapse entirely. Salem Village was a place where everyone knew everyone else's business, or believed they did. Families lived close together, often on land that had been disputed for generations. Property lines were vague. Inheritances caused resentment. Old arguments never fully disappeared. They simply waited. When the trials began, these buried tensions found a new and powerful language. Accusations often followed existing fault lines. One family would accuse another, and soon relatives joined in, reinforcing each other's claims. Entire households were pulled into the storm. In some cases, children accused parents. In others, servants accused masters. The trials inverted the usual order of authority, giving power to those who had rarely held it before. This shift was intoxicating and terrifying. To be an accuser was to be believed, protected, and listened to. To be accused was to be stripped of status instantly. Reputation, built over a lifetime, could be erased in a single afternoon. Years of piety meant nothing against the claim that your spirit had appeared in someone else's nightmare. Social pressure intensified everything. Ministers preached about hidden sin. Magistrates warned that mercy toward witches endangered the entire colony. Ordinary people watched neighbors taken away in chains and drew their own conclusions. If the authorities believed this was real, then doubting it felt reckless. Doubt could look like sympathy. Sympathy could look like allegiance. The courtroom itself became a theater of fear. Accusers writhed on the floor, screaming that invisible hands were choking them. Judges watched closely, interpreting every movement. If the accused raised a hand, the accuser might scream louder. If the accused looked away, it was said to prove guilt. The body itself became evidence. Many of the accused tried to reason with the court. They spoke calmly, quoted scripture, insisted on their innocence. These efforts often failed. Calmness could be seen as deception. Faith could be framed as false piety. The more composed someone appeared, the more dangerous they seemed. Others broke under pressure. They confessed to impossible crimes, describing meetings with the devil, flights through the night, and secret gatherings in the woods. These confessions were often shaped by leading questions. Officials asked about familiar symbols, black animals, strange books. The accused learned quickly what kind of story the court expected. Survival depended on telling it convincingly. Once someone confessed, they were encouraged to name others. Each new name widened the circle of fear. Accusations spread outward like ripples, touching people who had never been close to the original events. Wealth offered no protection. Neither did education. Even ministers' wives were not safe. One of the most dangerous developments was the belief that witches could appear in spectral form without consent. This meant that even if someone was asleep, praying, or miles away, their spirit could still be blamed. The accused could no longer rely on alibis. Time and space stopped mattering. Jails filled quickly. Conditions were harsh. Prisoners were chained, sometimes to the walls, sometimes to each other. Food was scarce, unless families could afford to bring it. Disease spread easily. Children were imprisoned alongside adults. Some accused women gave birth in chains. Families faced impossible choices. To support an accused relative publicly was to risk suspicion. To distance oneself was a form of survival, but carried lasting shame. Some husbands testified against wives. Some parents believed accusations against their own children. The trials forced people to choose between loyalty and safety. What makes this period especially haunting is how normal life continued alongside the horror. Crops still needed harvesting. Meals were cooked. Church bells rang. Executions were scheduled between daily tasks. Death became routine, absorbed into the rhythm of the community. Yet cracks began to appear. Some people started to notice patterns that felt wrong. Accusations spread too widely. Too many respectable individuals were named. Ministers quietly expressed concern about spectral evidence. A few judges hesitated, though often too late. One turning point came when accusations reached the families of influential figures. When power felt threatened, skepticism grew louder. The logic that had once justified everything began to weaken. But for those already dead, this realization came too late. The tragedy of Salem lies not only in the executions, but in the way fear reshaped human relationships. It taught neighbors to watch one another instead of helping. It rewarded betrayal. It punished doubt. It turned belief into a weapon. And yet, even in this darkness, moments of resistance existed. A few people refused to confess. They chose death over lies. Others later admitted they had accused falsely, overwhelmed by pressure and terror. These acts did not stop the trials, but they remained quiet testimonies of conscience. As accusations continued to spread and the machinery of justice rolled forward, the community stood at the edge of something irreversible. The question was no longer whether witches existed, but whether Salem could survive what it was becoming, or if fear had already rewritten its future beyond repair. As the circle of accusation widened, the faces of the accused began to tell a deeper story, one that went beyond fear and belief and into the quiet details of individual lives. These were not abstract figures labeled as witches. They were mothers, farmers, widows, craftsmen, and children, each carrying a history that suddenly mattered in a dangerous new way. Many of those accused lived on the margins of Salem's strict social order. Some were poor and dependent on charity, a status that already invited resentment. Others were outspoken women who challenged authority in small but memorable ways. A sharp tongue, a refusal to submit quietly, or a habit of arguing in public could linger in memory, waiting for the right moment to resurface as evidence of corruption. There were also those whose only crime was difference. Enslaved people, outsiders, and those with unfamiliar customs were easy targets. Their presence unsettled a community obsessed with uniformity. When fear demanded an explanation, difference became guilt. Take the case of elderly women who lived alone. In a society where survival depended on family and cooperation, independence was suspicious. If a cow fell ill after an argument, or a child sickened after refusing charity, coincidence was reinterpreted as intent. Memory reshaped itself to fit expectation. Men were not immune. Farmers with land that others wanted, merchants involved in disputes, or men who challenged church authority found themselves accused as well. Once the trials gained momentum, no one's gender or status guaranteed safety. The idea that witchcraft could hide behind respectability became one of the most powerful engines of the hysteria. For the accused, survival required navigating an impossible system. Those who confessed were spared execution, at least for a time, but confession demanded the surrender of identity. They had to describe themselves as servants of the devil, traitors to God and community. Some complied, believing survival was worth the cost. Others could not bring themselves to lie, even when they knew the consequence. One man, pressed beneath stones for refusing to plead, chose silence over submission. The weight crushed his body slowly, deliberately. He reportedly asked only for more weight. His refusal protected his family's property, since a conviction would have allowed it to be seized. It was an act of resistance, shaped by love and grim calculation. Children, too, were pulled into the nightmare. Some were accused. Some were accusers. Young minds, surrounded by adult fear and expectation, learned quickly what was rewarded. Confessing to witchcraft could bring attention and relief from punishment. Accusing others could turn terror into control. Years later, some would admit they had not understood what they were doing. Life in jail tested endurance in quieter ways. Chains cut into skin, cold seeped into bones, illness spread. Pregnant women gave birth in confinement, their newborns entering a world already shaped by accusation. Families sold belongings to bring food to imprisoned relatives. Poverty deepened, survival became a daily negotiation. Faith remained central, even for those condemned by it. Many prayed constantly, believing that God saw the truth even if the court did not. Some forgave their accusers publicly before execution. These acts were recorded and remembered, unsettling those who witnessed them. If a condemned person could die with such calm, what did that say about their guilt? Over time, the list of accused began to challenge the logic of the trials themselves. When respected church members, wealthy landowners, and even relatives of officials were named, unease grew. The idea that the devil had infiltrated so deeply forced people to confront a terrifying implication. Either no one was safe, or something was fundamentally wrong. Some ministers began to question the use of spectral evidence. They worried that the devil could impersonate the innocent, making false accusations inevitable. These doubts were cautious and often private, but they mattered. They introduced the possibility that the court was being manipulated by the very force it claimed to oppose. Still, executions continued. Each death normalized the next. The community adapted to loss with a grim efficiency. Funerals followed executions. Fields were tended. Life went on, carrying the weight quietly. The accused who survived carried lasting scars. Confessors lived under suspicion long after the trials ended. Their survival marked them as compromised. Those who maintained innocence but escaped execution were not celebrated. They returned to communities that had already accepted their guilt. What emerges from these individual stories is not a tale of madness alone, but of people making choices under extreme pressure. Some chose survival, some chose truth, some chose silence. All were shaped by a system that rewarded fear and punished doubt. The Salem Witch Trials were not driven by a single villain or a single mistake. They were built from countless small decisions, each one understandable on its own, each one narrowing the path back to reason. By the time many realized something had gone terribly wrong, the damage was already done. As the list of accused continued to grow and even the powerful began to feel vulnerable, one question lingered beneath every whispered doubt. If innocence could no longer protect anyone, what could possibly stop the machine that Salem had set in motion? Before we continue, take a moment here. If you have not subscribed yet, please do. This channel survives only because people choose to support calm, carefully told history like this. Without your subscription, this channel will slowly disappear, and stories like this will stop being told. By the time the trials reached their most intense phase, Salem was no longer simply reacting to fear. It was enforcing it. What began as scattered accusations had hardened into a system, one that moved with its own momentum and crushed anything that resisted it. The machinery of authority, once meant to protect the community, now served to accelerate its destruction. Special courts were established to deal with the growing number of cases. Judges were appointed who believed deeply in the reality of witchcraft and in their duty to purge it. They saw themselves as guardians, standing between God's order and total collapse. Every conviction felt like proof that they were winning a spiritual war. The courtroom became a place where reality bent under expectation. Accusers were treated as victims whose suffering validated the process. Their cries and convulsions were seen not as behavior to be questioned, but as evidence to be respected. The accused, by contrast, were expected to prove a negative. They had to demonstrate purity in a system that assumed corruption. Spectral evidence sat at the heart of this imbalance. The idea that a person's spirit could attack others independently of their physical body removed the need for material proof entirely. No physical mark, no witness, no motive was required. An accusation alone, if delivered convincingly enough, could carry the weight of a death sentence. This approach deeply disturbed some observers, even at the time. A few ministers warned that accepting such evidence placed too much trust in human perception and too little in reason. They feared that the devil, believed to be deceptive by nature, could manipulate visions and dreams. If that were true, then the trials risked condemning the innocent while believing themselves righteous. Despite these concerns, the court pressed forward. The urgency to act outweighed hesitation. Jails overflowed. Prisoners were transported between towns, chained together, watched constantly. The cost of imprisonment fell on families, pushing many into financial ruin. Land went untended. Livelihoods collapsed. Executions followed a grim rhythm. The condemned were brought to the gallows under guard. Ministers prayed. The accused were sometimes given a final chance to confess. Those who did were spared execution, reinforcing the idea that confession equaled truth. Those who refused were hanged. Public reaction was complex. Some wept openly. Others watched in silence. A few believed deeply that justice was being done. Over time, however, unease spread. The calm dignity of some condemned individuals troubled witnesses. Their prayers sounded sincere. Their final words expressed forgiveness rather than bitterness. These moments lingered in memory. One execution in particular shook the community. A respected former minister was accused and condemned. At the gallows, he recited the Lord's Prayer flawlessly, something witches were believed incapable of doing. The crowd wavered. Murmurs spread. For a brief moment, doubt nearly broke through the ritual of death. Authority intervened. The execution proceeded. Order was restored, but something had shifted. If a man so deeply rooted in faith could be condemned, then the trials no longer felt like a cleansing of outsiders. They felt like a turning inward, a threat to the very foundation of the community. Behind the scenes, political pressure mounted. Influential families began to worry about the reach of accusations. When relatives of leaders were named, skepticism grew sharper. What had once been acceptable when directed at the powerless became intolerable when it approached the center of authority. The governor, initially supportive of the trials, began to reconsider. Reports reached him, questioning the reliability of evidence. Ministers urged caution. The number of accusations continued to rise, but confidence in the process quietly eroded. Eventually, the court was suspended. Spectral evidence was disallowed. New trials were ordered under stricter rules. Without the ability to rely on invisible attacks and dreams, most cases collapsed. Accused individuals were acquitted or released. The machinery that had seemed unstoppable only weeks earlier slowed, then halted. For those already dead, this change came too late. 19 people had been executed. One had been crushed. Several others died in prison. The end of the trials did not erase what had happened. It only exposed how fragile the certainty behind them had been. The community was left with an uncomfortable silence. No celebration marked the end. There was no clear declaration of error. Life simply resumed, carrying the weight of what could not be undone. Survivors returned home to damaged reputations and empty homes. Accusers withdrew, some burdened by guilt, others by denial. Years later, apologies were offered. Some accusers publicly admitted their actions had been wrong. Compensation was paid to families of the condemned. Courts formally cleared names. These gestures mattered, but they could not restore lost lives or erase trust. The Salem Witch Trials ended not with justice triumphant, but with exhaustion and regret. They revealed how easily fear can be given authority, how quickly systems can turn belief into violence, and how difficult it is to stop once momentum takes hold. And even as the community tried to move forward, one unresolved thought remained beneath every apology and every cleared name. If a society so certain of its faith and purpose could fall into such darkness, what protections truly exist to prevent it from happening again? When the courts finally fell silent and the last prisoners were released, Salem did not return to normal. There was no clear moment when the fear lifted, no single day when people agreed that it was over. Instead, the hysteria receded slowly, like water draining from a flooded field, leaving behind warped ground and broken structures that could not easily be rebuilt. Those who walked free carried the trials with them. Survival itself became complicated. Former prisoners returned to homes that had been ransacked or seized. Farms had gone untended. Livestock had been sold to pay jail fees. In some cases, houses stood empty, their owners executed or dead from disease contracted in prison. Neighbors avoided eye contact. Old friendships did not resume easily. For the families of the executed, grief was sharpened by injustice. There were no proper funerals for those hanged. Their bodies were often buried in unmarked graves, sometimes by relatives under cover of darkness. Loved ones had to mourn quietly, because open anger could still be dangerous. Even after the trials ended, suspicion lingered like smoke. Children who had lost parents were taken in by relatives or left to fend for themselves. Some families were permanently fragmented. A household that had taken generations to build could be destroyed in a single season of accusation. The loss was not only emotional, but generational. Accusers, too, faced a complicated aftermath. Some were celebrated quietly for having helped purge evil. Others became uneasy reminders of a time people wanted to forget. A few would later confess publicly that they had been wrong, driven by fear or pressure. These confessions were acts of courage, but they did not always bring forgiveness. One young accuser stood before the church years later and admitted responsibility for multiple deaths. She spoke of deception, of being misled, of guilt that had followed her into adulthood. Her words were recorded, not as punishment, but as warning. The community listened, heavy with memory. Authorities moved carefully toward acknowledgement. Courts eventually declared many of the accused innocent. Names were cleared. Financial compensation was offered to families, though often years later and never enough to repair what had been lost. These acts were meant to close the chapter, but closure proved elusive. Religious leaders reflected publicly on the trials. Sermons shifted in tone. Where once they had emphasized vigilance against hidden evil, now they spoke of humility, restraint, and the dangers of unchecked certainty. This change was subtle but significant. It signaled an awareness that faith alone could not replace reason. The legal system also changed. The use of spectral evidence was formally rejected. Standards of proof became stricter. The trials left behind a deep suspicion of testimony based solely on visions or dreams. In this way, the tragedy shaped future justice, carving caution into law. Yet even as reforms took hold, the memory of Salem remained uneasy. People spoke of the trials in hushed tones. Some families avoided the topic entirely. Others preserved records carefully, determined that the truth not be lost. History became a battleground between forgetting and remembering. What lingered most was the awareness of how ordinary the participants had been. There was no single villain who could be blamed and discarded. The judges had believed they were righteous. The accusers believed they were suffering. The community believed it was under threat. This realization was unsettling because it offered no simple comfort. Salem forced a confrontation with the darker side of certainty. It showed how belief, when fused with fear and authority, could justify cruelty without malice. It revealed how systems designed to protect could be repurposed to destroy, and it left behind a warning written not in theory, but in lives. As years passed, the trials became a symbol, not just of superstition, but of moral panic. Writers, historians, and reformers returned to Salem again and again, each searching for lessons. Some saw it as a failure of religion, others as a failure of law. Still others as a warning about social pressure and conformity. For the descendants of those involved, the legacy was personal. Family names carried weight. Some traced ancestry to the accused, others to accusers or judges. Identity became intertwined with memory. The past refused to stay buried. Salem's story traveled far beyond Massachusetts. It entered political speech, literature, and education. It became shorthand for injustice driven by fear, yet this distance sometimes softened its reality. The trials risked becoming metaphor rather than history, stripped of the human suffering that defined them. To remember Salem honestly requires resisting that abstraction. It means sitting with discomfort. It means acknowledging that the people involved were not fundamentally different from people today. They loved their families. They feared loss. They sought meaning in chaos. Under pressure, they made choices that felt necessary at the time. The aftermath of the trials did not offer redemption in any complete sense. Apologies could not resurrect the dead. Compensation could not erase trauma. But the willingness to admit error mattered. It represented a break from denial, a recognition that authority could fail. And still, questions remained unresolved. How quickly could something like this happen again? What conditions would be required? Which safeguards would hold and which would fail? Salem did not provide easy answers, only a record of what unfolded when fear outran restraint. As the community moved forward, carrying both guilt and grief, the trials settled into history. But history, when ignored, has a way of resurfacing. And as Salem tried to rebuild trust in law, faith, and one another, the quiet question remained, unspoken but persistent. When fear returns wearing a different name, will the lessons learned here be enough to recognize it in time? Long after the last cell door closed and the courts disbanded, Salem continued to live inside the minds of those who had survived it. The trials were over, but their logic lingered. Fear does not vanish simply because it is disproven. It fades slowly, reshaping itself into caution, silence, and memory. In the years that followed, people spoke more carefully. Accusations did not disappear from New England life, but they no longer carried the same unchallenged authority. The trials had revealed how easily testimony could be shaped by expectation, how quickly emotion could masquerade as evidence. This realization did not make communities kinder overnight, but it made them more guarded. The legal aftermath mattered deeply. Colonial courts began to reconsider how truth should be determined. Testimony based on dreams, visions, and invisible attacks lost its power. Judges became wary of cases driven by mass fear. The idea that evidence must be observable, verifiable, and grounded in reality gained strength. This shift did not emerge from enlightenment alone, but from trauma. Salem had shown what happened when boundaries dissolved. Religious life changed as well. Ministers who once thundered about hidden sin adopted a quieter tone. Sermons emphasized mercy and self-examination rather than accusation. The devil did not disappear from belief, but he became less central to explaining everyday misfortune. Faith remained strong, but it was tempered by the memory of how easily it could be weaponized. Still, guilt moved unevenly through the community. Some judges publicly acknowledged their errors. One wrote of deep remorse, calling the trials a tragedy born of misguided zeal. Others remained silent, perhaps unable or unwilling to confront their role. Silence, too, became part of the legacy. For accusers who had been children, adulthood brought a heavy reckoning. Memory matured. What had once felt like confusion or performance became something darker in retrospect. Some lived quietly, avoiding attention. Others carried public guilt, knowing their words had ended lives. Their stories remind us that harm does not require intent, only power combined with fear. Families of the accused preserved memory in private ways. Stories were passed down carefully, sometimes softened, sometimes sharpened. Names once spoken with shame were reclaimed with pride. The act of remembering became an act of resistance against erasure. Over time, Salem transformed from a place of pain into a place of reflection. Outsiders came seeking lessons. Writers turned the trials into allegory. Political leaders invoked Salem as a warning against hysteria and persecution. Each retelling reshaped the story, sometimes clarifying it, sometimes flattening it. This transformation carried risks. When Salem became metaphor, its human cost could fade. The 19 executed became symbols rather than people. The children imprisoned became footnotes. The grief of families risked being overshadowed by the convenience of the lesson. Remembering accurately required effort. Historians returned to original records, transcripts, and letters. They examined handwriting, word choice, pauses in testimony. Through these fragments, voices emerged. Fear sounded different when read closely. Hesitation became visible. Pressure revealed itself in repetition. The past regained texture. What emerged was not a single explanation, but a web. Economic strain, religious absolutism, political instability, personal grudges, gender expectations, childhood vulnerability. All of these interacted, reinforcing one another until collapse became inevitable. Salem was not an anomaly. It was a convergence. This realization carries uncomfortable implications. If Salem was not unique, then its conditions could recur. Fear paired with certainty remains powerful. Authority still shapes belief. Communities still seek simple explanations for complex suffering. The names change, but the structure endures. Modern societies often comfort themselves by pointing to education or progress. But Salem's people were not ignorant in the way caricature suggests. They were literate, organized, deeply reflective within their worldview. Their tragedy was not stupidity, but overconfidence in a system that rewarded conformity over doubt. The trials also exposed the danger of moral urgency, the belief that action must be immediate, that hesitation equals complicity, fueled decisions that could not be undone. In Salem, restraint was seen as weakness. Mercy was framed as risk. This inversion remains familiar. Yet Salem also left behind resilience. The willingness to eventually admit error mattered. It did not heal everything, but it created space for reform. It allowed later generations to inherit not just guilt, but warning. Few societies confront their failures openly. Salem, imperfectly, did. The quiet power of the story lies in its unresolved nature. There is no final redemption, no moment where balance is restored. Instead, there is memory, layered and incomplete. The trials resist closure because closure would imply understanding, and full understanding remains elusive. Standing at historical distance, it is tempting to ask what should have been done differently. Who should have spoken sooner? Who should have refused? These questions matter, but they can also distance us. They frame Salem as a puzzle already solved, rather than a mirror still reflecting. Perhaps the more difficult question is inward. Not what Salem did wrong, but what conditions we tolerate that resemble it. Where fear is rewarded, where doubt is punished, where identity becomes evidence, where urgency silences reflection. Salem endures not because it was extreme, but because it was plausible. It unfolded step by step, each decision justified by context, belief, and survival. That is what makes it dangerous. That is what makes it human. As the story settles into history, stripped of immediacy but heavy with consequence, one thought remains unresolved, echoing across centuries. When fear once again offers certainty and demands obedience, will memory be strong enough to slow us down before judgment becomes irreversible? As the decades passed, the Salem Witch Trials drifted further into the past, but they did not fade. Instead, they settled into the foundations of American memory, shaping how later generations understood justice, authority, and fear. The trials became something people returned to when trying to name a feeling that was otherwise difficult to describe. The moment when suspicion overtakes reason and certainty demands sacrifice. In the years following the trials, colonial society changed slowly, almost reluctantly. There was no revolution of thought, no sudden embrace of tolerance, but something had cracked. The idea that communal belief alone could determine guilt had lost its innocence. Courts became more cautious, ministers more restrained. Ordinary people, though still deeply religious, carried a quieter awareness that even righteous intentions could lead to catastrophe. This awareness did not erase prejudice or fear. Native communities continued to face violence and dispossession. Enslaved people remained trapped in systems of brutal exploitation. Women still lived under rigid expectations. Salem did not end in justice, but it added a scar to the collective conscience, one that made future moral panics harder to justify openly. As the colonies grew and later became a nation, Salem's story traveled with them. During periods of unrest, political leaders invoked it as a warning. Writers returned to it when exploring the danger of conformity. Teachers used it to explain why legal protections mattered. Each generation reinterpreted Salem through its own anxieties. During times of war, when loyalty was questioned and dissent punished, Salem's shadow lengthened. When neighbors informed on neighbors, when accusation became proof of patriotism, the echoes were unmistakable. Salem offered language for discomfort, a historical reference that allowed people to say, without naming present dangers directly, that something felt wrong. Yet this use of Salem also carried a risk. When invoked too easily, it lost specificity. It became shorthand rather than history. The complexity of individual lives disappeared behind the metaphor. The danger was not that Salem would be forgotten, but that it would be simplified. Historians worked against this flattening. They returned to court transcripts and personal letters, reconstructing the rhythm of testimony and the texture of fear. They examined how questions were asked, how answers were shaped, how silence was interpreted. Through this work, Salem regained its human scale. What emerged was a story not of madness, but of pressure. People were pushed to choose quickly, publicly, and irrevocably. Ambiguity was not tolerated. To hesitate was to risk suspicion. This environment rewarded decisiveness over wisdom, alignment over reflection. One of the most enduring lessons of Salem is how systems amplify fear. Individually, many participants doubted, hesitated, or felt uneasy. Collectively, those doubts were overwhelmed. Authority provided reassurance. Ritual provided structure. Once fear was organized, it became powerful. Salem also reveals how language shapes reality. Words like witch, confession, and evidence carried meanings that differed from modern assumptions. To confess was not simply to admit guilt, but to align oneself with the moral narrative of the community. To deny was to resist that narrative and risk annihilation. The accused who refused to confess occupy a difficult place in memory. They did not survive. Their choice brought no immediate change, and yet their refusal stands as one of the few points where the system met an immovable boundary. Their silence exposed the cruelty of a process that demanded falsehood as the price of life. Over time, these figures came to symbolize integrity under pressure, not because they were saints, but because they revealed the cost of conscience. They remind us that moral clarity often carries consequences, and that systems built on fear rarely reward truth. The trials also complicate ideas about victimhood. Accusers suffered too. Many were genuinely distressed, physically and emotionally. Some experienced symptoms we might now recognize differently. Their pain was real, even if its interpretation was catastrophic. This does not excuse the harm they caused, but it resists simple villain narratives. Salem forces us to hold multiple truths at once. That fear can be sincere. That sincerity does not guarantee accuracy. That good intentions can coexist with devastating outcomes. These tensions make the story enduring because they resist resolution. As modern audiences encounter Salem, there is often a desire for distance, to believe that education, science, or law would prevent similar events today. And yet, Salem's conditions were not ignorance alone, but urgency, division, and moral absolutism. These are not relics. Periods of crisis still produce simplified narratives. Threats are still personalized. Complex causes are still reduced to human targets. Salem's relevance lies not in its strangeness, but in its familiarity. The physical landscape of Salem reflects this tension. The town continues. Streets are walked, homes are lived in, tourists arrive seeking spectacle, sometimes missing the gravity beneath it. The challenge of remembrance is balancing engagement with respect, curiosity with care. For descendants of those involved, Salem remains personal. Names carry weight. Archives carry responsibility. To research family history is to encounter choices made under unimaginable pressure. Judgment becomes difficult when the past feels close. Salem's endurance also speaks to the human need to find meaning in tragedy. We return to it not because it comforts, but because it unsettles. It asks questions without offering easy answers. It insists that morality is not abstract, but lived, decision by decision. Perhaps the most difficult legacy of Salem is accepting that there is no final safeguard, no belief system, no legal code, no education level guarantees immunity from fear-driven injustice. Protection lies not in certainty, but in humility, in the willingness to pause, in the courage to doubt one's own righteousness. As Salem receded into history, it became both warning and mirror, a record of what happened, a reminder of what could. And as each generation encounters its own pressures, its own urgencies, its own demands for conformity, Salem waits quietly in the background, asking not whether we remember it, but whether we truly recognize ourselves within it. And that leaves one final unresolved thought hanging in the space between past and present. When the next moment of collective fear arrives, will Salem be remembered as a distant tragedy, or will its lessons be close enough to change what happens next? By the time Salem settled fully into history, its story had already begun to change shape. What had once been lived experience became memory, then record, then interpretation. And with each transformation, something was gained and something was lost. The trials no longer belonged only to those who suffered through them. They became part of a larger conversation about power, fear, and responsibility. Early accounts focused on explanation. Writers searched for causes that would make the events understandable, even containable. Some blamed individual judges. Others pointed to specific ministers. A few focused on the behavior of the accusers, especially the children, framing the tragedy as the result of manipulation or deceit. These explanations offered comfort because they localized the problem. If blame could be assigned narrowly, then the wider society could remain innocent. But over time, this approach began to feel insufficient. As more documents were examined, a broader pattern emerged. The trials were not an accident caused by a few bad actors. They were the result of an environment where fear was normalized, authority was unquestioned, and moral certainty was valued more than restraint. The system did not fail accidentally. It functioned exactly as it had been designed to function under pressure. This realization shifted how Salem was taught and discussed. It became less about witches and more about process, less about superstition and more about human behavior. The focus moved from the extraordinary to the ordinary, from what made Salem strange to what made it familiar. In this reframing, everyday details took on new significance. The way questions were asked in court, the language used in sermons, the structure of village governance. These elements, often dismissed as background, were recognized as active forces. They shaped outcomes not through malice, but through habit. One of the most revealing aspects was the speed at which norms changed. Before the trials, accusing a neighbor of witchcraft was serious and risky. During the trials, it became routine. Afterward, it became shameful again. This rapid moral shift showed how fragile ethical boundaries can be when reinforced primarily by consensus rather than principle. Salem also exposed how fear seeks legitimacy. Panic alone is unstable. It needs structure to endure. In Salem, that structure came from courts, clergy, and law. Once fear was endorsed by authority, it gained permanence. It could be organized, repeated, and enforced. This dynamic continues to resonate. Modern societies often assume that injustice emerges only when rules are broken. Salem suggests something more troubling. Harm can arise when rules are followed too faithfully, when procedures are obeyed without questioning their foundations. Obedience, in this sense, becomes a risk. The trials also invite reflection on the nature of evidence. Salem's courts accepted testimony that could not be tested, challenged, or disproven. Once such evidence was allowed, rational defense became impossible. The accused were trapped not because they were guilty, but because the system had removed the possibility of innocence. This lesson echoes far beyond witchcraft. It speaks to any situation where accusation carries more weight than verification, where emotion substitutes for proof, and where narrative overtakes reality. Salem reminds us that justice depends not only on intent, but on method. Another enduring thread is the role of community pressure. Many participants later expressed doubt or regret, but during the trials, dissent was rare. Not because everyone agreed, but because disagreement carried risk. Salem shows how silence can become complicity, not through cruelty, but through fear of isolation. This silence was not always passive. Sometimes it was strategic. People calculated what could be said safely. They adjusted behavior to avoid attention. They learned when to speak and when to disappear. These survival strategies were rational responses to an irrational environment. In this way, Salem also tells a story of endurance. People adapted. They navigated danger. They protected children, hid opinions, and endured loss. Survival did not always look heroic. Often, it looked like compliance. This complicates moral judgment. It forces us to ask not what people should have done, but what options were actually available. The trials also altered how future generations thought about responsibility. The question of blame became diffuse. Was guilt shared by all who participated? By those who watched silently? By those who benefited indirectly? Salem resists clean moral accounting. Responsibility spreads outward until it becomes uncomfortable to assign. This discomfort is part of why Salem endures. It does not allow distance. It insists on proximity. It challenges the assumption that moral failure is rare or isolated. Instead, it suggests that under the right conditions, many people can be drawn into systems that harm others while believing themselves justified. As Salem entered literature, these themes deepened. Writers used the trials to explore guilt, conformity, and resistance. Fiction allowed what history could not always capture: internal conflict, hesitation, private fear. These stories did not replace historical record, but they expanded its emotional reach. Yet even literary retellings had limits. They often focused on individual heroes or villains, simplifying a collective tragedy into personal drama. While compelling, this approach risked reinforcing the idea that Salem could have been avoided if only a few people had acted differently. The reality was more complex. The truth is that Salem required participation at every level. It required belief, enforcement, compliance, and endurance. It required ordinary routines to continue alongside extraordinary cruelty. That is what made it sustainable, and that is what made it devastating. Modern audiences often search for reassurance in Salem's ending. The trials stopped. Apologies were made. Names were cleared. These facts matter, but they should not be mistaken for resolution. The harm was irreversible. The learning was incomplete. The safeguards remained fragile. Perhaps the most sobering aspect of Salem's legacy is how quickly its lessons can be forgotten. Each generation believes it is wiser than the last. Each believes it would recognize injustice sooner. And yet, fear continues to find new forms. Accusation continues to offer simplicity. Authority continues to promise safety. Salem does not tell us that humanity is doomed to repeat its worst moments. It tells us that vigilance requires effort, that skepticism must be practiced, not assumed, that moral courage is rarely dramatic and often lonely. The trials ended centuries ago, but the conditions that enabled them remain part of human society. Division, uncertainty, the desire for certainty at any cost. Salem remains relevant not because it was extreme, but because it was achievable. As the story stretches toward its conclusion, it leaves us not with answers, but with responsibility. To remember accurately, to question confidently, to recognize when fear is being organized and given authority. And so the final question lingers, unresolved and necessary. When pressure mounts and certainty is demanded, will we recognize the early signs of Salem's logic returning, or will clarity only arrive once the damage is already done? In the end, Salem does not close its story with resolution, but with inheritance. What remains is not a conclusion, but a responsibility passed forward, quietly and without ceremony. The people who lived through the trials did not know they were creating a lesson for the future. They were trying to survive their present. And yet, survival itself became the thread that carried meaning across centuries. The Salem Witch Trials endure because they refuse to stay contained in their time. They resist being classified as a single error, a moment of collective madness corrected and left behind. Instead, they persist as a pattern, one that can be traced whenever fear becomes moralized and authority sanctifies suspicion. Salem teaches not through spectacle, but through repetition. What makes this story especially unsettling is how familiar its mechanisms remain. Fear arose from uncertainty. Uncertainty demanded explanation. Explanation required enemies. Enemies required proof. Proof was redefined until it could no longer be challenged. At no point did the participants believe they were abandoning justice. They believed they were refining it. This is the quiet danger Salem leaves behind. Injustice rarely announces itself as cruelty. It often arrives dressed as protection, duty, or necessity. The people of Salem did not wake each morning intending to destroy their neighbors. They woke believing they were defending their community from collapse. The trials also demonstrate how easily moral urgency overrides patience. The pressure to act quickly, to eliminate threat before it spreads, fueled decisions that bypassed reflection. Delay was framed as weakness, doubt as disloyalty. This atmosphere did not encourage careful thought. It punished it. Modern societies often reassure themselves that safeguards now exist. Laws are codified, rights are protected, evidence is regulated. And yet, Salem reminds us that systems are only as strong as the values that animate them. When fear reshapes those values, even robust institutions can be bent. The accused of Salem were not defeated by argument, they were defeated by narrative. Once the story of witchcraft took hold, facts were filtered through it. Every denial became deception. Every inconsistency became confirmation. The story absorbed everything, leaving no room for escape. This is why Salem remains relevant in conversations about power. Those who control narrative control outcome. When accusation defines reality, defense becomes meaningless. The trials show how language itself can become a weapon, shaping perception until truth has nowhere to stand. Yet, Salem is not only a story of failure, it is also a story of limits. The hysteria did not last forever. Doubt eventually returned. Authority was challenged. Procedures were changed. The machine stopped. These moments matter, not because they undo harm, but because they demonstrate that even entrenched systems are not eternal. What brought the trials to an end was not a sudden awakening, but accumulation. Too many accusations, too many contradictions, too much discomfort. Change arrived slowly, driven as much by self-preservation as by conscience. This is an uncomfortable truth, but an honest one. Salem teaches that progress is rarely pure. It is often reactive, hesitant, and incomplete. People do not abandon harmful systems because they suddenly become virtuous. They abandon them because the cost becomes undeniable. This does not make progress meaningless, but it does make it fragile. The memory of Salem challenges the idea that history moves cleanly forward. Instead, it suggests cycles, periods of fear followed by reflection, moments of certainty followed by regret. The lesson is not that humanity improves steadily, but that it stumbles, remembers, and sometimes adjusts. For those who are executed, memory is the only form of justice that remains. Their names endure not because they were witches, but because they were wronged. Their stories survive as reminders that innocence is not self-protecting, and that truth does not always prevail in the moment it is most needed. For those who accused, memory is more complicated. Their suffering was real, their fear was real, their actions were devastating. Salem forces us to hold these truths together without collapsing them into simplicity. It resists the comfort of clear villains. This complexity is what makes Salem valuable. It refuses to let us distance ourselves. It refuses to let us say we would have been different without examining why. It demands humility, not confidence. As time passes, Salem risks becoming decorative, a tourist site, a symbol, a cautionary tale repeated so often it loses its weight. The true challenge is not remembering Salem's name, but remembering its structure. The structure begins with division, economic strain, social resentment, competing visions of authority. It grows through belief, hardened into identity. It accelerates through fear validated by power. It becomes irreversible when dissent is framed as danger. These conditions are not relics. They appear whenever communities feel threatened, whenever complexity becomes unbearable, whenever certainty promises relief. Salem waits patiently in these moments, not as destiny, but as possibility. And yet, Salem also offers a quiet form of hope. Not the hope of perfect prevention, but the hope of recognition. That by studying the past honestly, without romance or simplification, we sharpen our ability to see patterns before they harden. The people of Salem did not have that distance. We do. That distance is not a guarantee, but it is a tool. It allows us to ask harder questions, to pause when urgency demands speed, to notice when evidence becomes symbolic rather than factual. Salem ultimately asks very little of us. Not perfection, not certainty, only restraint. The willingness to doubt our own righteousness. The courage to question systems that feel comforting because they offer clarity. The patience to sit with uncertainty rather than resolve it through accusation. As the story fades back into silence, leaving behind records, names, and unanswered grief, it does not close with instruction, but with invitation. To remain alert, to remain humble, to remember that fear is persuasive, especially when it speaks in the language of protection. And so the final unresolved thought remains, as it has since the last execution, hovering just beyond comfort. When fear once again demands belief and certainty offers safety, will we recognize the familiar shape forming in front of us, or will understanding arrive only after memory has added new names to the list Salem began?